A racist officer breaks an elderly black man's arm, unaware the man's son is an Army general. 78-year-old Leonard Hayes had always been the epitome of quiet dignity. A retired schoolteacher and a Vietnam veteran, Leonard had spent decades teaching history to high school students, mentoring them not just in academics, but in life. His years of service to his country and community had shaped him into a man of steady resolve. Now, in his golden years, Leonard enjoyed the simpler things: his meticulously kept garden, long walks through his familiar neighborhood, and daily calls with his son, Marcus Hayes, an Army general stationed overseas. Marcus was Leonard's pride and joy, a man who carried the same integrity and strength that Leonard had tried to impart in him from a young age. It was a brisk Tuesday morning when Leonard decided to make his weekly trip to the convenience store. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and Leonard bundled himself in his thick wool coat, a knitted hat pulled low over his ears. His cane, a trusty companion for the past few years, tapped lightly on the sidewalk as he walked, greeting neighbors with a polite nod. The convenience store, a small corner shop he had frequented for years, was just a short distance away. As he approached, Leonard noticed a police cruiser parked at an odd angle, its front wheels partially on the curb. Standing near the entrance was a young police officer, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he surveyed the area. Leonard didn't think much of it. Police presence wasn't unusual in the area, and he had always treated officers with respect, a habit from his days in the service. "Good morning," Leonard said, giving the officer a polite nod as he passed. The officer, whose name tag read Brian Carter, didn't respond. Instead, his sharp blue eyes tracked Leonard with a mix of suspicion and contempt. Leonard felt the weight of the gaze on his back but continued into the store, not wanting to cause any trouble. Inside, the store was warm and familiar. Leonard greeted the cashier, a young man named Thomas, and took his time browsing the shelves, picking up a carton of milk and a loaf of bread. He exchanged light conversation with Thomas at the counter before paying, slipping his receipt into his coat pocket. As Leonard stepped outside, he was greeted by a sharp bark. "Hey, old man!" Leonard turned, surprised to see Officer Carter striding toward him. His posture was aggressive, his hand still resting on his holstered weapon. "Yes, officer?" Leonard asked, his voice calm but wary. "What were you doing in there?" Carter demanded, stopping a few feet away. His tone was sharp and accusatory, as though Leonard had been caught committing a crime. "I was buying groceries," Leonard replied, lifting the small paper bag in his hand as evidence. Carter's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Don't play dumb with me. I've seen you hanging around here before. You people always have an angle." The words stung, but Leonard kept his composure. "I'm just a man getting food for his home," he said firmly, though he could feel a knot forming in his stomach. Carter took a step closer, his hand now gripping Leonard's arm roughly. "Empty your pockets," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Leonard's heart began to race, but he stood his ground. "Officer, that's unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong." Carter's grip tightened and he yanked Leonard forward, nearly causing the elderly man to lose his balance. Leonard winced, his cane slipping from his grasp and clattering to the pavement. "Stop resisting," Carter barked, though Leonard hadn't resisted at all. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Bystanders exchanged worried glances, their murmurs growing louder as Carter pushed Leonard against the side of his patrol car. "You're hurting him," a man in the crowd shouted, but Carter ignored the protests. With one swift, brutal motion, Carter twisted Leonard's arm behind his back. A sickening crack echoed through the air, followed by Leonard's anguished cry. The elderly man collapsed to the ground, clutching his arm as pain radiated through his frail body. The small bag of groceries spilled onto the pavement, the milk carton bursting open and pooling in the gutter. The loaf of bread rolled a few feet away, its packaging smudged with dirt. Carter stepped back, looking down at Leonard with disdain. "Next time, do what you're told," he sneered, his voice cold and devoid of remorse. Without another word, Carter climbed back into his cruiser and drove off, leaving Leonard lying on the cold concrete. The crowd remained frozen for a moment, shocked by what they had just witnessed. A woman stepped forward, kneeling beside Leonard. "Sir, are you okay? Let me help you." Leonard nodded weakly, his face pale and his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice trembling. As the woman called for an ambulance, Leonard's thoughts turned to his son. Marcus would want to know what had happened. And Marcus, a man who had faced battles both on and off the field, wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. Hours after the brutal incident, Leonard Hayes sat quietly in a stiff plastic chair in the hospital emergency room. His arm rested in a makeshift sling, the searing pain from his fractured bone radiating through his body. Despite the nurse's reassurance that the doctor would see him soon, Leonard felt a different ache, a deeper one. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the humiliation, the injustice, the weight of being treated like a criminal despite having done nothing wrong. As he waited, Leonard's thoughts turned to his son, Marcus. After years of serving overseas and climbing the ranks of the army, Marcus had become a general, a decorated and respected figure in the military. But despite his son's accomplishments, Leonard had always made it a point not to burden him with his own problems. However, this time things were different. With his uninjured hand, Leonard fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Marcus's number. When his son answered, Leonard's voice, usually calm and steady, came out in a shaky whisper. "Marcus," Leonard said, his voice betraying the pain and exhaustion he felt, "something happened." "Dad?" Marcus's voice was sharp, immediately concerned. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Leonard swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "An officer, he stopped me outside the store, said I was up to no good. He grabbed me, twisted my arm, and—" Leonard paused, wincing as the memory replayed in his mind. "He broke my arm, Marcus." The other end of the line went silent for a moment. Then Marcus spoke, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge of fury. "Who did this to you?" Leonard hesitated, reluctant to relive the details, but Marcus pressed gently. "Dad, I need to know everything. Don't hold back." With a deep breath, Leonard recounted the encounter, his words faltering as he described how Officer Carter had humiliated him in front of the crowd, twisted his arm until it snapped, and left him lying on the cold concrete like trash. Marcus listened intently, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. Every word stoked a fire in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed for his father's sake. When Leonard finished, Marcus's response was firm and unwavering. "I'm coming home, Dad. I'll take care of this." The next morning, Marcus arrived in his hometown. He stepped off the plane in his full army dress uniform, the medals on his chest glinting in the sunlight. His presence was commanding, his tall frame and crisp attire drawing stares from passers-by. Marcus wasn't just any soldier. He was a man who had led battalions into battle, someone who understood discipline, respect, and, above all, justice. He drove straight to the hospital where he found his father sitting in a private room. When Marcus walked in, Leonard's face lit up, though the pain in his eyes was still evident. "Marcus?" Leonard said softly, his voice tinged with relief. Marcus strode over, taking in the sight of his father's bruised face, the sling cradling his injured arm, and the weariness etched into his features. It was a sight that made Marcus's chest tighten with anger. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "are you okay? Did the doctors say anything?" "They said it'll heal," Leonard replied, "but Marcus, I didn't want to drag you into this. You've got more important things to worry about." Marcus knelt in front of his father, looking him directly in the eye. "There's nothing more important than this. No one lays a hand on my father and gets away with it." Leonard nodded, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. "I didn't call you to fight my battles, son. I needed you to know." Marcus's expression hardened. "This isn't just your battle, Dad. It's ours now, and trust me, I know exactly how to handle this." After leaving the hospital, Marcus began gathering information. He spoke to witnesses who had been outside the store during the incident. Many of them had recorded parts of the altercation on their phones, and Marcus quickly obtained the footage. The videos showed Officer Carter grabbing Leonard, twisting his arm behind his back, and slamming him against the car before walking away without offering any assistance. The more Marcus uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Other residents shared their own experiences with Carter, stories of intimidation, excessive force, and abuse of power. Marcus listened carefully, his anger simmering but controlled. "How can I help you, sir?" the officer asked, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus's face and the row of ribbons on his chest. Marcus's voice was steady but firm. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge. It's about Officer Brian Carter and an incident involving my father." The officer faltered, his fingers hovering over the phone. Let me call the captain. Please have a seat?" "I'm fine standing," Marcus replied, his sharp gaze scanning the room. The receptionist, visibly rattled, made the call. Within minutes, the precinct captain, a stocky man with graying hair named Captain Rhodes, appeared at the far end of the station. Behind him was Officer Carter, his confident smirk betraying that he thought this meeting would be little more than a formality. When they entered the conference room, Marcus refused to sit. Instead, he stood at the head of the table, towering over the others like a general addressing subordinates before battle. Carter leaned casually against the wall, his smug expression making Marcus's fists itch, but he forced himself to remain composed. "All right, General Hayes," Captain Rhodes began, his tone neutral but wary. "I understand you're here about an incident involving your father." Marcus set a folder on the table. "Not just an incident, an act of brutality," he said, his voice cold. He flipped the folder open, revealing photographs of Leonard's injuries, his swollen arm, the deep bruises along his shoulder, and the medical report confirming the fracture. He pushed the photos toward the captain. "These are the results of Officer Carter's incident." Rhodes glanced at the photos, his brow furrowing. He cast a quick glance at Carter, whose expression flickered for a moment before returning to its usual arrogance. "That's not the whole story," Carter interjected, his tone dripping with indifference. "Your dad was resisting, and I had to act. He was causing a disturbance." Marcus cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "He's a 78-year-old man who was walking home with a bag of groceries. That's what you call a disturbance?" Marcus leaned forward, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over Carter. "You broke his arm and left him on the ground like trash. Don't insult me by pretending it was justified." Carter's smirk faltered, but he straightened, doubling down. "I did what I had to do. He wasn't cooperating." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his tone measured. "You didn't have to twist his arm behind his back. You didn't have to slam him into the car, and you didn't have to leave him lying there while you drove off." Captain Rhodes raised a hand, trying to de-escalate. "General Hayes, I understand your frustration. We'll conduct a full internal investigation." "An internal investigation?" Marcus scoffed. His calm mask cracked just enough to reveal the fire simmering beneath. "With all due respect, Captain, I've seen what internal investigations do. They buy time, bury the truth, and protect men like Carter." He pointed a finger at Carter, his voice rising. "This man isn't just unfit to wear a badge. He's a danger to the community." Rhodes shifted uncomfortably, realizing he was dealing with more than just an angry civilian. "What exactly do you want us to do, General?" Marcus leaned forward, his hands on the table. "I want accountability. I want a formal investigation, not just within the department but with the district attorney's office. And I want Officer Carter removed from duty until that investigation is complete." Carter laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You can't just march in here and demand—" Marcus turned to him, his voice a low growl that silenced the room. "You're lucky I'm giving the system a chance to handle this. If it were up to me, you'd be facing a court-martial, not a disciplinary review." The room went silent. Even Captain Rhodes looked uneasy. Marcus wasn't done. He reached into his folder and pulled out a flash drive, sliding it across the table. "Here's video footage taken by bystanders during the assault. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses. I've already made copies and forwarded them to the district attorney's office. The media will be receiving them next if nothing is done." Rhodes stared at the flash drive, the weight of the situation sinking in. "General Hayes," he said carefully. "I assure you, we'll take this seriously." "You'd better," Marcus said, straightening up, "because if you don't, I will, and I guarantee you don't want to see what I'm capable of." Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and walked out of the room, his polished boots striking the floor with deliberate force. Carter, for the first time, looked genuinely shaken, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's authority. Back at the hospital, Marcus sat with his father relaying what had happened at the station. Leonard listened quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite his pain. "I didn't raise you to fight my battles," Leonard said softly. Marcus smiled back, his voice firm but warm. "No, Dad. You raised me to fight for what's right. This isn't just for you, it's for anyone who's been on the receiving end of people like Carter." Leonard nodded, his pride in his son shining through the exhaustion in his eyes. "You're a good man, Marcus. Your mother would be proud." The battle for justice had only begun, but Marcus was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. In the weeks that followed Marcus's confrontation at the precinct, the wheels of justice began to turn. The flash drive Marcus had provided became the cornerstone of a formal investigation, not just into Officer Carter's actions that day, but into his entire career. Complaints that had previously been dismissed or ignored resurfaced, painting a damning picture of a man who had long abused his badge. The media latched onto the story, with headlines reading, "Army General Fights for Justice After Father's Assault by Officer," and "Pattern of Abuse Uncovered in Local Police Department." Protesters gathered outside the precinct demanding accountability, while community leaders called for sweeping reforms. Captain Rhodes, under immense pressure, expedited the internal investigation, but the damage to the department's reputation was already done. Carter was formally charged with aggravated assault and misconduct, his smug arrogance evaporating as he was led out of the precinct in handcuffs. At his trial, the video evidence and witness testimonies left little room for doubt. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Carter sat stone-faced as the sentence was read, 5 years in prison and a permanent ban from law enforcement. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted into cheers as news of the conviction spread. For many, it was a victory not just for Leonard, but for every victim of abuse of power. At home, Leonard was slowly healing. His arm, though still in a cast, no longer throbbed with constant pain, and the bruises on his shoulder had begun to fade. Marcus stayed by his father's side, managing physical therapy appointments and helping with household tasks. They spent long afternoons on the porch, the quiet moments a balm after the chaos of the past month. One such afternoon, Leonard sat in his favorite rocking chair, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. His cane rested beside him, though he used it less and less now. Marcus sat nearby, his broad shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks as he sipped a cup of coffee. Leonard broke the silence. "You didn't have to do all this, Marcus," he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and pride. "But you did. You stood up for me, for what was right." Marcus shook his head. "You're my father, Dad. You've spent your whole life teaching me about honor, about standing up when no one else will. All I did was follow your example." Leonard's weathered face softened into a smile. "It's a damn good example you're setting yourself, son. I see it in the way you carry yourself. You've made me proud every step of the way." Marcus nodded, his gaze distant as he thought about the work still to be done. "This isn't just about Carter, though. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again, to anyone. The fight isn't over." True to his word, Marcus became involved in broader efforts to bring change to the community. He partnered with local activists to push for mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight of police misconduct, and de-escalation training. The incident had sparked a larger conversation, and Marcus used his platform as an Army general to amplify those voices. Leonard, too, found his own way to contribute. He began attending community meetings, sharing his story to encourage others to stand up against injustice. Though the experience had shaken him, he refused to let it define him as a victim. Instead, he became a source of inspiration, a reminder of resilience and dignity in the face of adversity. Months later, the community came together for a special event at the town square, the unveiling of a memorial plaque dedicated to victims of police brutality and those who had fought for justice. Leonard and Marcus stood side by side as the plaque was revealed, the crowd applauding warmly. Leonard took the microphone, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "What happened to me shouldn't have happened to anyone, but because of my son and this community, we've taken steps toward making sure it doesn't happen again. It's not about one man's fight, it's about all of us standing together." The applause swelled, and Leonard stepped back, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're my legacy," he said quietly. "Everything I've done, everything I've fought for, it's in you now." Marcus looked at his father, his eyes glistening. "And I'll carry it forward, I promise,"